Divisions amongst a few, he writes, are most observed because it is expected that weak parties should be...
The pages of history.
Fire behind the second line!
Turning one after another,
On your base!
but not in a book. Here, the pages of history turn into the events of day-to-day life. Life as it was lived 3.5 centuries ago. In what has become one of America's most significant landmarks, where English settlers established a permanent New World home, in what was to become New England. Plymouth Plantation.
As a nation, we have come to revere the Pilgrims. Yet much of what passes as knowledge about them has been based on myth and misinformation. Until, that is, Plymouth Plantation dedicated itself to recreating the realities of life in 17th century Plymouth. Today, we can visit not just the region in which that important historical seed was planted. We can visit the time when it was taking root and beginning to flourish.
So we ask this day that...
Here, at one of this country's most dynamic and engaging non-profit museums, we can see life unfolding in homes like those our European ancestors built to shelter themselves against a harsh wilderness. At the museum's Mayflower exhibit, we can feel the same wind that bore those early colonists here in 1620. Here, we can walk the decks of a modern-day Mayflower, reconstructed in the style of an authentic 17th century vessel. Just a few miles away, we can stroll through a bustling Plymouth plantation on a typical afternoon in 1627. Nearby, in yet another of the museum's historical recreations, we can visit a Wampanoag Indian settlement and see how the land's original inhabitants lived. It was the Wampanoag people who befriended the European immigrants and helped them survive here. But most remarkably, we can actually meet and talk to the men and women who lived through one of the most famous chapters in American history. That famous group of settlers known as the Pilgrims. Today, at Plymouth Plantation, they greet us, ready and willing to explain firsthand what this land demanded of them and what it promised in return.
One of his wives, open my grip on the other side of the hill.
The basic facts of the Pilgrim story are well known. In 1620, a group of travelers left England aboard a small ship. The passenger list included names that were to become some of the most famous in American history. Governor William Bradford, Miles Standish, John and Priscilla Alden. They left behind them their homes and families and a society that had rejected their religious beliefs. Ahead of them lay the New World and a precious chance to live and worship according to their faith. They settled in what is today Plymouth, Massachusetts. Life was hard, but the settlers were determined. Despite severe weather and near starvation, by 1627, their dream of a permanent settlement in North America was developing into a reality.
What isn't so well known to most of us today is what life was really like for those history-making settlers. Of the structures they built, none remains. Only a relative handful of artifacts from their day-to-day existence have survived the centuries. Ways of hunting, growing food, and cooking have undergone a significant transformation since their era. As dramatically as lifestyles have changed, however, conceptions about life itself have changed even more in the centuries since 1627. Now, Plymouth Plantation's commitment to living history is bringing more than 750,000 visitors a year face to face with a richly and authentically recreated past in one of America's most famous hometowns. What they discover is often not what they were expecting.
A lot of people come here and are very, very surprised by what they see. Even if they've done some study in history before, I think most people still have that stereotype of a person who never smiles, wearing black clothing with a white collar, who spends all their time doing nothing but read the Bible and put people in the stocks. And I think most people, when they leave, have a different attitude about the place. They say, wow, it was just a live place with all kinds of people living their lives.
For a visitor coming through, I think it's a shock sometimes. Some visitors have the idea that the Pilgrims came and built federal-style houses and elected George Washington president. The house with a thatched roof and clapboards on the side and a dirt floor looks wrong to them, but it's not. That's the way the house would be constructed, and that is a big shock for a lot of visitors.
It'll be about another quarter of an hour, I should think.
Oh, well, it's not so bad.
A person can come into your town and suddenly he's in a place where everything's done different and the beliefs are very different than his own and the assumptions about life and about what people should be doing are very different.
We'd slide up alongside them Portuguese and say, all right, hand over them fish, or we're putting them back where they come from.
The 17th century is much more foreign than the 20th century Russia. It's a very foreign experience.
Some Spanish silver on the way back home and made a fair amount of money on all that stuff.
Misconceptions and misunderstandings can distance us from our past, even more than time itself. Here at Plymouth Plantation, a bridge across the centuries is being built on a foundation of painstaking historical research.
We take the research that normally culminates in writing a book and represent it in 3 dimensions. We will never really know precisely what the site in 1627 looked like. We have some information about what the site looked like. We have some information about the various landmarks within the village. For example, we know for a fact that there was a fort. We know there were some common houses. But what we have done is recreate this environment based on the evidence that exists right now. So we try to find evidence that will lead us in the right direction. In our case, the best evidence is description of the original settlement. So if we have some descriptive material, diaries, written material such as Governor Bradford's history of the colony, we use that first. We go to the next level of evidence, which is primary sources that pertain to settlements in England of the period. All the settlers came from English agricultural communities, or virtually all of them did. And so we go back to England, we find out what was typical in many of these areas, we find out what sorts of houses, what sorts of structures, what sort of pattern of buildings existed, and then we apply that information here.
In a way, Plymouth represents a huge historical detective story in which almost all the evidence has vanished and must be accurately recreated.
What we are is a recreation. There's nothing really old here. Everything is not only been recreated in the last few years, but very well may be replaced in a few years to make sure it's correct. We are more, therefore, a museum of culture, of an indeterminable, indefinite thing, than we are of artifacts or sacred items, relics of the past. When people come to Plymouth Plantation, what they see is a recreation of a culture that has vanished.
Well, that doth bring to mind the circumstances of our living into Amsterdam and where my...
At today's Plymouth Plantation, every detail of life 350 years ago has been recreated. Buildings, tools, crops, livestock, clothing, and more. Each and every item within view represents historical knowledge transformed into physical reality by the museum's talented and committed staff of researchers, curators, and craftspeople.
We make furniture, we make the buildings here, and make items that haven't been made for hundreds of years. Well, what gets me the most excited is to look at an object, whether it's a chair or a table or a house, and understanding myself how a man 200, 300 years ago made it. What kind of challenges were presented to him. We had found a piece of furniture, a paneled chest, that was attributed to a member of the Plymouth Colony. We went and looked at the chest, took many measurements from it, and looked to see how the gentleman made the chest to begin with. Then we went out, selected a tree, cut down the tree, and split it up into parts. Never saw a power tool the whole time. We try to reproduce 17th century woodworking methods. That's quite important, and it does set us apart from many, many other museums and gives us a special, interesting twist.
Plymouth Plantation's commitment to authenticity extends throughout its recreated world of 1627. The clothing worn at Plymouth hardly fits the standard image of pilgrim attire. The fact that you don't see the stereotypical tall black hats, white starched collars, or buckled shoes is another of the historical surprises unveiled here. In addition, each costume reveals another rich detail about what life was like in earliest America.
They wear corsets, waistcoats, bodices, capes, gabardines, a variety of clothes. There is a certain amount of station involved. I think Alice might have been a little bit more worldly. Being married to the governor, she had to display herself publicly in a most respectable way, no different than any other political figure of today would have to do. But perhaps even more so with the limitations of here. I think Alice would dress far superior to any servant girl or good wife that you might find in town.
You get your title from your husband. Those folk that aren't married, well, simply you call them by name.
I'll give you some more.
A close look at the animals being raised and cared for at Plymouth Plantation brings you closer to the past in yet another way. By combining a sharp eye for historical detail with a carefully planned cross-breeding program, Plymouth is able to recreate an animal population that looks more like its 17th century counterpart than its modern peers. The colony's hogs, for example, resembled wild boar much more than today's plumper, pinker pigs. By studying the animals and paintings of the period, then mating 2 different modern swine, the museum has been able to obtain animals that a member of the original colony would recognize. It's another dramatic example of history come to life.
There, Your Worship. The crew's got together and we're ready to make way for the fishing grounds.
You've a cold day to be on the sea, but I pray you shall have a fine catch.
I dare say, Your Worship. My thanks to you. God keep you.
Godspeed to you. Well, Will.
Perhaps no feature of a visit to Plymouth Plantation is more revealing or more remarkable than encounters with the museum's unique core of role players.
Husband.
Aye?
I would much favour it if at dinner today you would refine your talk from your usual mealtime conversation, if you would not talk of the pucks and of men in Jamestown eating their wives. Or I shall perhaps give you a bit of a pinch if you need a reminder.
Role-playing, having costume people adopt the roles of real live folks in a historical sense, is the logical extension of living history into the human dimension.
Please, hit the boot, please.
The difference between having a lecture delivered by a person who's adopted the role of the professor And having somebody present information in a non-abstract, personal way is a very significant difference indeed in terms of the ability of the people who are visiting to comprehend, to receive the information.
So which day is the 7th?
Well, according to the apostles, they did begin worshipping on the 7th.
I think had we known that our church would not be together by this time, we would have thought differently about the coming over, for our church numbered well near to 400 in Holland, and I think within our walls now we have less than 100 of our church members here.
There's all sorts of heretics and all.
Each role player portrays a different member of the original Plymouth Colony. This unique and demanding presentation technique brings visitors to today's Plymouth Plantation closer than they've ever been to time travel. By lifting history out of its traditional display case environment and infusing it with life. Instead of inanimate objects and descriptive labels, the past at Plymouth Plantation resonates with human spontaneity, conversation and laughter, work and play, hope and fear, struggle and celebration. In such a rich and complex human environment, the more visitors know about what goes into the museum's presentation, the more they're likely to get out of all it has to offer. Guests who understand the reservoir of knowledge each interpreter possesses, and who can let their curiosity get the best of them, find rewards few other museums can provide.
Well, did you realize when you got on the ship to come here to the colony that you'd probably never see your family again?
Oh, why?
When you left, did you know that this is where you were going to end up?
No, the Lord did, but we did not. No, the Lord destined us here, whether we had favored it or not. We were bound for North Virginia, where the Hudson's River doth flow, and the Dutch have now settled these last 2-3 years.
Why is your house different from the others?
Well, this house is very quick to build. It saves labor and it saves time, and they're very warm. All you got to do is really dig a pit and put a roof over it.
I see.
And in the beginning, there were many more of these here. Their only disadvantage is they limit your space.
One of the reasons why we think our role-playing program here is so powerful is that the answers can be adjusted to suit the age level and the interests of the person who's doing the exploring.
Well, perhaps it is as Master Cushman hath writ, that we should endeavour to build only those houses that we could leave with no regret at all.
I think an interpreter is an educator. In some ways you are an actor, but you're an actor who's been put into an enormous set without a script.
I would not turn my head when I saw such.
But I think much more than an actor, it's an educator. I think it's important to tell the visitor to be mythbusters, in a way. I think it's important to break the romantic image of what the Pilgrims were like.
I think if I stayed in London, perhaps I would marry a rat catcher. I'll do no better than that.
The myth is very shallow. Once a visitor gets past that, you can make it much more interesting. You can teach them about the reality so that they can look at the 17th century from a 17th century point of view.
Well, Constance, being with child and all, she does find that the walks in the fresh air.
The impact of what an interpreter has to say is enriched by how he or she says it. Plymouth's colonists came from 17 different linguistic regions in England. At Plymouth Plantation, each interpreter's accent is carefully researched and rehearsed so that the accents visitors hear reveal something about the background of each of the pilgrims.
And the reasons why my father chose to leave of the Church of Ancient Brethren and join up with Pastor Robinson's church, for he did believe that such...
For their states, for as you have 1 ox and 2 oxen, you have 1 state and 7 staten, so they have staten.
Ultimately, each aspect of an interpreter's portrayal represents a mastery of historical knowledge and historical understanding.
Did you ever think we would eat so well upon campus?
It's very difficult to understand how far-reaching a first-person interpreter is. We take on the role of a real person, and we don't make up the facts. We're ever learning new facts, and I think that's really exciting about history, is we don't know everything about history. We're always learning about history. An interpreter is someone that can give the visitor the facts and the feelings of someone that lived in the 17th century. This isn't something that you can get out of a book. It's information that's been compiled from books and letters, and it's a cumulative effort on the part of the research departments here, and we've brought that all to life.
I think it's important that we keep our customs set in. The way we dress and how we speak certainly is the way my mother did things and the way your mother did as well.
Well, it is needful that we have civil order in this place. Elsewise, we will have such problem as other settlements here in the New World have had.
To fully understand the mindset of individuals from the 17th century, you almost have to leave your own 20th century mindset, you know, at the door, literally. I mean, you've got to kind of forget all the things that you've learned in the process that you've learned them in.
It's a wondrous thing here to sit in the meeting house and sing praises unto God at the top of your voice and not have to worry of the king's horsemen coming to take you away for your trouble.
Well, beyond trying to forget everything you know beyond the year 1627, there's the compounded situation where each year we portray 1627 again. And so as you return each season, you have to forget things that happened in August of 1627. You have to go back to April 1627. And sometimes when you're interpreting and you're trying to explain something to a visitor, you say, wait a minute, has that happened this year yet or not?
I think it is most difficult that we do not have a proper pastor, a fellow what is ordained, and our hearts are sore for that. And we ain't got no mills either, and that's not so easy, for a housewife must grind all the corns into flour by her hands. That's a very crude method, I think. I always feel like it's a really good example for women today to see, first of all, how much things have changed, and secondly, maybe to see that things haven't quite changed enough.
Set himself to a sorry lot and to learn, I fear.
As a visit to Plymouth Plantation reveals, the past is at once a foreign yet familiar place. People who pay a return visit here are likely to discover that tomorrow's past is even closer to the year 1627 than today's. At Plymouth Plantation, the effort to learn more is ongoing, and every historical truth uncovered will find its place in the museum's presentation.
There's always new information coming. Research is always coming up with new things. We've leaned fairly heavily on English corn. We know that it didn't grow very well, and the Indian corn grew much better. But it's beginning to look as if we've been using too much English corn, and that we're going to have to take that gradually out of the food that we display, and introduce a lot more Indian corn, which is going to mean looking for new ways of using the Indian corn, which is going to be quite a challenge.
It's quite probable we'll never really know exactly what it looked like here in Plymouth. The most we can do is to always keep up to date. As soon as anything is discovered that's new, we change, we introduce. We keep our truth by continually moving, by continually keeping things as best as possible.
This?
You've been walking by yourself before too long.
Oh, I think that's certain true.
Plymouth Plantation is committed to making history both accessible and meaningful to people today.
One of the things that we hear our visitors say regularly when they leave the village is that it was fun. We feel that there's a direct correlation between visitors having a good time, finding it engaging, and learning. We felt that there was an intrinsically important story that was being obscured by the myths. The Pilgrims were not larger than life. They didn't do things that people today can't do. I think they illustrate the ability of people who are not satisfied with circumstance to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, if you will, to take action, take charge of their destinies. If you have strength and courage and and perseverance and a sense of what you want to accomplish, that things can change. And I think that's the essence of what makes the Pilgrim story important.
The multitude of their trespasses drive thou them away, for they are turned rebellious against thee. And rejoice.
If you are interested in learning more about some of Plymouth Plantation's educational programs and the services offered to visitors, including opportunities for dining and shopping, or if you would like information about ways to join or support this unique museum, contact Plymouth Plantation, P.O. Box 1620, Plymouth, Massachusetts 02360.